April 17, 2015, the city of Kumertau, Republic of Bashkortostan, Russia. A resident of one of the four-story Khrushchev-era apartment blocks on Karl Marx Street, Tatyana Savushkina, name changed, is seeing her husband off to work. Tatyana is the building supervisor, and it's her job to keep things in order. The woman knows that there is a girl living on the second floor who is under 18, and that a group of guys often gathers at her place, so she keeps an eye on the troubled apartment. Tatyana's husband puts on his shoes and opens the door to go out into the hallway. Both spouses are immediately hit by a strong smell of burning plastic, as if someone is burning bottles right on the stair landing. The smell is so acrid that both Tatyana and her husband start coughing. Smoke is seeping out from under the door of that very troubled apartment. It looks like there's a fire in there. She hopes no one gets poisoned by the smoke. The man leaves for work and Tatyana immediately dials 01. The firefighters who arrive don't waste any time. No one answers the knock, and within a minute the door is broken down to get inside. The apartment is filled with smoke. The kitchen and pantry are on fire, but that's not the worst part. The most terrifying sight is the 5 bodies lying in huge pools of blood, with their throats slit and signs of attempted dismemberment. Later, forensic experts will count around 160 stab wounds on the bodies, and a pentagram carved with a knife will be found on one of the girls' bodies. You are on the Strashnota channel, and today we have a case about how an ordinary hangout can turn into a terrifying bloodbath. Kumertau is a small town in the south of the Republic of Bashkortostan, with a population of just over 55,000 people. To ordinary people, it is known mainly as the hometown of the singer, the lead vocalist of the popular late 80s and early 90s band Laskovyi Mai, Yuri Shatunov. In all other respects, it's a typical provincial town, like thousands of others in Russia. And Sergei Bukayev, who was born and raised in this town, also seemed at first glance to be its most typical resident. In 2015, he turned 24 years old. Bukayev lived in a panel high-rise building with his mother and stepfather, studied by correspondence at the Kumertau Mining College, and didn't work anywhere. He spent his days simply reading books, chatting with friends online, and watching TV series one after another on his old computer. The only truly close person he had was Konstantin Surkov. They met back in 2009 in college and had hardly been apart since then. Surkov was not just an acquaintance for Bukayev but his only true friend. He shared everything with him. Together they walked around the city, often spent time at Konstantin's house, and their favorite hangout spot was the concrete slabs near the railway bridge where their group used to gather. The place was simply called the Slabs. Other friends of Bukayev and Surkov also gathered at the Slabs: Leonid Peresunko and his girlfriend Irina Starikova, Masha Samodelkina, Nastya Semenovskik, and Raphael Novoselov. Masha, Nastya, and Raphael weren't even 18 yet, but nobody cared. Everyone drank together and had fun as equals. Sometimes the group would move to Masha's or Leonid's apartment. It was easier to go to Maria's place. The 16-year-old girl lived without her parents. Her mom and grandmother had moved to another city.
Almost every weekend, practically every day, a crowd would constantly gather here. And I know for sure that it was from there. I don't know what they were doing there, but I know they always met there. There was, well, not exactly a crowd, maybe 5 or 6 people, but they were definitely there. They always met at her place.
Friends often stayed at Samodelkina's place until morning or slept right there, some in the kitchen, some in the bedroom, some in the living room. However, there was a fact in Bukayev's biography that set him apart from the ordinary residents of the city. The guy had a criminal record for robbery, and although he got off with a suspended sentence, the Criminal Enforcement Inspectorate kept a close eye on him. At least they were supposed to keep an eye on him? As it would turn out later, in reality, of course, things were different. Konstantin Surkov was also born and raised in Kumertau. In 2015, he turned 22. His mother worked as an English teacher. She raised her son alone and tried to give him the best she could. According to acquaintances, he was a well-read and bright boy, charismatic, pleasant, and nice to talk to. However, as soon as you got to know him a little, it became clear that there was darkness inside this boy. Surkov had been deeply interested in edged weapons for a long time. He liked beautiful, sharp knives. He could spend a long time looking at their pictures, holding them in his hands. He didn't have any fighting techniques. He never trained, but just the feeling of a heavy handle and a cold blade in his palm clearly gave him pleasure. That's why he often carried a knife with him. Surkov was also fascinated by the cult of death. His VK page was called Lucifer's Blood, the blood of Lucifer. I mean, blood means blood, but let's just say blood. Sounds better, a dark nickname, dark symbolism. There are dozens of comments on the page dedicated to death and the desire to end one's life. Lucifer's followers romanticized the tragedy of taking one's own life, posted photos depicting their supposed death, and shared stories about occult forces and those who had left and come back. Later, this page would become one of the reasons why the media put forward the theory of a ritual crime. The only person Surkov was truly close to was Sergei Bukayev. He shared his dreams and plans with him. Both of them, Bukayev and Surkov, were registered with a neuropsychiatric clinic. The diagnosis could not be found, but it is known that Surkov was also registered with an addiction specialist because he abused alcohol. His mother tried to talk sense into him, but it was useless. He would explode, start shouting, and slam doors. Surkov met Leonid Peresunko when he was in the hospital, and Peresunko's mother would later say that she witnessed one of Surkov's tantrums. We had heated arguments about whether the stress in the surname Peresunko falls on the second to last or last syllable. I decided to stress Peresunko on the second to last syllable, but if the stress actually falls on the last syllable, please correct me in the comments. Later, Leonid often said that Surkov is a real psycho. About 6 months before that fateful night, Surkov and Bukayev got really drunk. The conversation turned to friendship, to what true friends are capable of. In a drunken haze, they made a kind of pact. If one of them took someone's life, the other was obliged to help finish off the victim, eliminate witnesses, and cover their tracks. Just ordinary drunken talk that no one took seriously, until it became reality. Surkov's and Bukayev's friends also seemed like ordinary people at first glance. However, some unusual details were found in the biographies of a few of them. Leonid Peresunko was the same age as Surkov. He had a fascination with everything dark and otherworldly. Acquaintances recalled that he was fascinated by mysticism, enjoyed reading history books, and often told his mother about Celtic crosses, the devil's 666, occult symbols, and so on. He and Surkov often discussed these topics, and Leonid was a frequent visitor to his page, Lucifer's Blood. At the time of the crime, Leonid was not employed anywhere. The day after that fateful night, he was supposed to register at the employment office and start looking for an official job. He had an affair with Irina Starikova. They even started living together for a while. Irina's mother rented an apartment for them. Irina herself, who was 21 years old, came to Kumertau from Yakutia just 4 months before the tragedy. She grew up in a well-off family and behaved quite normally for a girl her age. The only striking feature was her hair. Irina constantly dyed her hair in neon colors, sometimes toxic green, sometimes bright pink, and sometimes in unimaginable shades. Shortly before her death, Irina finally registered her residence and managed to complete her training as a hairdresser. Apparently, she planned to work in her field. Rafael Novoselov was in the 10th grade. The guy was unusually calm and level-headed for his age. At home, they called him a little man. He helped his mother around the house, fixed the curtains, carried heavy things, and tried to take some of the burdens off her. His mother, Zimfira, trusted him completely. Raphael often spent the night at Maria's, and his mother let him go without worry because, as she said, her son never came back from there drunk or acting strangely. She was sure that the kids were just reading poetry, watching movies, and discussing books. In that very apartment where it all happened, Maria, her mother, and her grandmother were registered. For the past 3 years, the older women had been in another town, and Masha stayed in Kumertau alone because of her studies at college. Her mother would come to visit her daughter and sometimes stayed overnight. She wasn't worried that Masha was living almost independently. According to her, she strictly controlled her daughter's circle of friends and strictly forbade her from having large get-togethers without permission. Nastya Semenovskih seems to be the most positive one in the group. The girl was involved in sports, volleyball and basketball, and played on the city's comedy team, Chernosliv. At New Year's events, she traditionally dressed as the Snow Maiden, smiling, radiant, with a long braid. Nastya was always very active, organizing things and taking part. She mostly got 4s and 5s. In the year she died, she was finishing 11th grade and was already making plans for the future, planning to enter Orenburg State University. Some of these young people were taking their first steps into adulthood, while others were still in school and just about to say goodbye to their childhood. None of them were supposed to die that April night in the apartment on the outskirts of Kumertau. On that ill-fated day, everything started out quite innocently. It was Thursday, and the weekend was approaching. Surkov, Bukayev, and their company gathered outside in the evening and first headed to the slabs. There, under the cold April wind, they drank vodka mixed with beer straight from the bottle. The guys flirted with the girls, the conversations grew louder, and the jokes became more uninhibited. When the bottles were empty, they decided to continue at Samodelkina's apartment. You could come to her place at any time. Mashka didn't have a stepfather who would grumble and say it was already late. There was no mother who would start lamenting about the girls being obviously drunk. They brought more alcohol with them. It was only 3 in the morning and no one was in a hurry to leave. They quickly settled in front of the computer in the bedroom. Irina launched Skype, remember that one? And she called her friend. "Are you awake? We're just relaxing here," she began to say cheerfully. "Lenka, Nastya is here with me." The screen glowed with a bluish light, and the room was thick with the smell of cigarettes and cheap alcohol. Everyone was laughing, shouting over each other, and passing the bottle around. Bukayev and Surkov sat, drinking and joking. And at first everything was just as it should be. Evening, a group of friends, drinks. Morning was approaching, and one by one the guests started to get sleepy. The group gradually split up and went to different corners. Maria went to sleep in the bedroom. Raphael headed to the storage room. Irina and Nastya went to the living room. Surkov followed after her. He liked her, and being a bit drunk, decided not to miss his chance. And in the kitchen, under the yellow light of the bulb, 2 people remained, Leonid, Lizunya, and Sergei Bukayev. There, among the empty bottles and overflowing ashtrays, an argument gradually flared up between them. Bukayev started it, who suddenly remembered that Lenka used to steal and would take phones and money out of his friends' pockets. "You're a pickpocket, Lenka. How many times have you stolen from your own friends? Phones, money? Do you remember how you took that girl's phone? Right out of her bag? Like a total rat," said Bukayev, not really holding back with his words. Leonid tried to make excuses, but it came out awkward. "Come on, that was ages ago. I gave it back later." But Bukayev kept pressing, wouldn't let it go, and didn't change the subject. It seemed like he enjoyed watching Peresunka squirm, fidget, and try to dodge the issue. "By the way, where's my phone?" Bukayev suddenly asked, as if he just remembered. "You stuck it in your pocket. It was right here on the table." Peresunka boiled over at such an unfair accusation. The voices instantly rose to shouting, and the kitchen filled with swearing. The air, already thick with tobacco smoke, seemed to become even denser and heavier. Under the light bulb, the faces of both men turned red and glistened with sweat. Peresunka lost control of himself. He swung his arm briefly and punched Bukayev in the chest, hard, with drunken anger. Bukayev's eyes narrowed. His hand confidently gripped the handle of a large kitchen knife. He struck sharply, aiming at the spot where the neck meets the shoulder. The knife entered Leonid's body with a distinct heavy sound, once, twice, 3 times. Bukayev struck furiously, silently, only breathing heavily through clenched teeth. Leonid tried to shield himself with his hands, to step back, but in the cramped space of the tiny kitchen, there was nowhere for him to go. One of the blows landed on his carotid artery. Blood spurted out immediately. Hot, scarlet, with a distinctive metallic smell. Leonid started to wheeze, grabbing his throat, but a forceful jet was already pulsing between his fingers. A gurgling wet sound escaped from the guy's mouth. His legs gave way. His body slowly slid down the wall. In just a couple of minutes, Leonid was dead. Later, the examination would determine that Peresunka's death was caused by massive blood loss due to damage to the carotid artery and jugular vein, as well as blood aspiration. Simply put, it means that he was literally choking on his own blood until he lost consciousness. Leonid was still wheezing and convulsing in agony, desperately scratching the blood-slicked floor with his fingers, when Irina and two others approached Leonid. Irina was the first to appear. She had just left the hall, sleepy, slightly swaying from the alcohol she had drunk, and almost immediately stumbled upon the shocking scene. Her boyfriend was sitting by the wall in a pool of his own blood, and above him stood Bukayev with a knife in his hand. Irina's eyes widened in horror. She only managed to exhale, Leonya. At that very moment, Bukayev spun around sharply. There was nothing human left in his eyes, only drunken rage and animal fear. With a single leap, he was beside her, shoved Irina against the wall, and drew the knife across her throat. Blood instantly gushed from the deep wound, soaking her chest and thin t-shirt. The girl grabbed her neck with both hands, but her fingers immediately became slippery and useless. Irina collapsed heavily to the floor next to Leonid, convulsing and desperately trying to press on the wound while she was still conscious. She didn't even have time to scream. Konstantin Surkov, who came in after them, froze on the kitchen threshold with his mouth open, looked at the blood, the two bodies, and fixed his gaze on his friend, standing motionless in the middle of the kitchen with a knife. "She'll tell everything," he said hoarsely, pointing at the convulsing Irina. She saw everything. Bukayev didn't answer. He just stepped toward the helpless girl and started hitting her again. The knife went into Irina's body again and again, 8 deep, furious stabs. Each time the blade sank deep into the body, all the way to the hilt. Blood spurted like a fountain, covering the kitchen linoleum, the walls, and the lower doors of the kitchen cabinets. Irina couldn't resist. She lost consciousness. A few seconds later it was all over. The girl grew still, her eyes glazed over. The kitchen now resembled a butcher shop. The metallic smell of fresh blood hung in the air, the floor was slippery and wet underfoot, and long crimson streaks remained on the walls and furniture. But the bloody night was just beginning. Surkov and Bukayev stood in the middle of the kitchen, breathing heavily, in pools of still warm blood. Both of their hands were red up to the elbows. The knife in Bukayev's hand was covered with a crimson film. Surkov just looked at him for a couple of moments, then said, "I thought you wouldn't be able to do it." After saying this, he went to the hallway, took his trusty knife out of his jacket, and returned to the room. At that moment, the fair-haired boy disappeared for good. In his place, there was only the one whose name perfectly fit a page called Lucifer's Blood. The one who, 6 months ago, promised his friend that if anything happened, he would help cover up the tracks. "We need to get rid of the rest," Surkov said, "otherwise everyone will find out." Bukayev understood that his friend was right. Masha, she was 16, Raphael and Nastya, who were both 17, all three were in the same apartment. "If even one of them talks, they're finished." "Yes, you're right," he croaked hoarsely. Surkov, without saying another word, gripped the knife in his hand and left the kitchen. The first one he found was Raphael. The guy was sleeping on the floor, curled up on an old mattress in a cramped storage room. Light from the hallway fell on his face when Surkov quietly opened the door. Raphael didn't even have time to fully wake up. The first blow landed in his chest, and the knife went in up to the hilt. The guy jerked sharply and screamed loudly, desperately, in a childishly high voice. Surkov struck again and again. The knife went into the body with a wet squelch, into the chest, the stomach, the arms with which Raphael tried to shield himself. Blood splattered on the pantry walls, on the boxes, and on the old things piled up in the corners. The guy fought back with all his might, scratching the attacker's hands, trying to break free. His screams echoed throughout the apartment. Bukayev was beside him in an instant. He said nothing, fell on top of Raphael and covered his mouth and nose with his hand, muffling the screams. The teenager thrashed beneath him like a fish out of water. His eyes were wide open with terror and pain, and Surkov kept stabbing furiously without stopping. The experts would count more than 50 knife wounds on the boy's body. Raphael didn't go quiet right away. His body kept twitching in convulsions for a long time under the weight of 2 grown men, until finally it went completely limp. When Raphael finally went quiet, a heavy ringing silence fell in the storage room, broken only by the heavy breathing of the 2 criminals. Bukayev wiped his hands on his pants and nodded to Surkov. "I'll take care of Masha, and you keep watch so no one comes in." He went to the bedroom where Maria was lying. The girl was in a drunken stupor, curled up under a thin blanket, unaware that 3 of her friends were already dead. Bukayev sat down on the edge of the bed and almost gently shook her shoulder. "Masha, wake up. Surkov is there. He tried to slit his wrists. There's blood everywhere. Come on, he's sitting in the bathroom. We need to bandage his arms." Maria opened her eyes in fear, still not fully understanding what was happening. A sleepy fear flashed across her face, but she obediently got up and, barefoot and wearing only a long t-shirt, followed Bukayev into the living room. Surkov was already waiting for her there. As soon as Maria crossed the threshold, Bukayev grabbed her hair from behind and sharply jerked her head back. With his other hand, he drew the knife across her throat deeply and confidently. The girl let out a short, gurgling sound and tried to break free, but she no longer had the strength. Blood gushed from the wound in a powerful stream, soaking the floor and her t-shirt. She fell to her knees, then onto her side, gasping for air. Surkov and Bukayev finished her off right there on the floor. The knives went into her body again and again, into her neck, chest, and stomach. When Maria went still, Bukayev didn't stop. He decided that he needed to cover his tracks as best as he could. Gripping the knife tighter, he began to cut the girl's body, trying to dismember it. The blade sliced through skin and muscle with a crunch, leaving deep, uneven cuts on the arms, legs, and torso. Blood flowed like a river, soaking into the carpet. Bukayev tried to cut a piece of flesh from the girl's abdomen, but quickly gave up on the idea. There was no time left. Masha's body was left lying in the living room, mutilated, with multiple deep cuts. The next was Nastya. Bukayev found her in the next room. The girl had apparently woken up from the screams and was now sitting on the edge of the bed, asking fearfully. Bukayev entered without a word. He immediately attacked her, threw her onto her back, and tore off her underwear. Nastya tried to scream and fight back, but he covered her mouth with his hand and sexually assaulted her brutally and cruelly, while the girl gasped and struggled beneath him. When he was finished, Surkov joined him. Then they pinned Nastya to the bed. Surkov took a knife and started drawing on her body. The knife slowly and deeply cut into her skin, carving strange, ominous patterns. He methodically made cut after cut, creating shapes on the girl's chest, stomach, and thighs that investigators would later classify as a pentagram. But there was no ritual in this brutal slaughter. Blood flowed from the wounds in thin streams, and Nastya remained conscious for some time. She cried and begged them to stop until the pain and blood loss finally made her lose consciousness. The girl's body remained lying on the bed, mutilated and covered in bloody patterns. After no one in the apartment was left alive, Surkov and Bukayev paused for a couple of minutes in the midst of the bloody carnage to catch their breath. Their hands, clothes, and faces were all covered in thick blood that had already begun to dry. Blood was already squelching under their feet, soaking into their shoes. They needed to leave, but first they had to cover up Nastya. Surkov picked up an almost empty bottle of vodka that was lying on the living room floor. First, he roughly tilted dead Nastya's head back and poured the rest into her mouth, so that some of the liquid spilled back out, mixing with the blood. Then he walked through the rooms and generously splashed vodka on the bodies of the others, on Leonid and Irina, on Raphael, on Maria. The sharp smell of alcohol mixed with the heavy scent of blood. Then he took a bag of coconut flakes and began to sprinkle them by the handful onto the bodies of Leonid and Irina. The white flakes stuck to the blood-soaked skin and clothing, looking completely absurd against the backdrop of the carnage. Later in court, Surkov was never able to clearly explain why he did it. Then he took all the knives he could find in the kitchen and began methodically stabbing them into the already dead bodies. He plunged the blade into the chest, the neck, the stomach, over and over again, as if he wanted to make sure no one would survive or simply finish off what was already lifeless. Bukayev decided to try to dismember the body again. He leaned over Leonid's body and started cutting the neck, trying to sever the head, but the knife was too dull and he barely had any strength left. The blade slid over the bones, tore the muscles, but he couldn't separate the parts. All he managed to do was leave deep, additional ugly cuts. It was established that some of the victims had their throats cut while they were still alive, and some after death. After finishing cleaning up, the guys decided it was time to leave. They quickly searched the apartment for money and valuables. The loot turned out to be modest. 4,000 rubles in cash, 1 mobile phone, several pieces of jewelry, 1 earring, and a commemorative Sochi 2014 coin with a denomination of 25 rubles, which, as they later found out, was worth about 350 rubles on the black market. It was time for the final chord of this deadly symphony. In the kitchen, Bukayev used his lighter to set fire to the long curtain on the window. Tongues of flame quickly ran up the synthetic fabric, filling the room with acrid black smoke. In the pantry, where Raphael was lying, he set fire to a piece of old cloth that was lying on the floor. The fire began to grow slowly but steadily, devouring the blood-soaked belongings and creeping closer to the bodies. The guys left the apartment, leaving behind a growing fire that, in their opinion, was supposed to destroy all the evidence and the bodies. The fire was extinguished by Emergency Situations Ministry personnel 45 minutes later, after responding to a call from Tatiana Savushkina. It became clear almost immediately that this was a mass killing and an attempt to cover it up with fire. No one was fooled. Surkov and Bukayev, after leaving the building, caught the first taxi they saw. They managed to wash the blood off their hands and faces, covered the stains on their clothes with jackets, and went to Bukayev's home. Sergei's mother opened the door for them. She looked sleepy and surprised. It was already almost 6 in the morning, but she immediately became alarmed when she saw blood on her son's clothes and long scratches on his face left by Nastya's nails. Surkov stayed standing in the entryway, not entering the apartment. Bukayev went inside alone. The stepfather wasn't home, and that worked in their favor. "What happened? Did you get into a fight?" His mother peppered him with questions. "No, Mom, everything's fine." Lenka cut his hand badly. "I need to go to the emergency room as a witness. It's urgent," Bukayev muttered, already heading to his bedroom. At first, the woman believed him, but when she saw her son frantically packing things into his backpack, she became suspicious and started asking questions. Bukayev immediately made up a new story. "I'm visiting a friend in Orenburg for a short time. Everything's fine." "What do you mean everything's fine? You come home at 6 in the morning in bloody clothes, and now you're planning to go somewhere? You're not going anywhere." While her son was getting ready, his mother went to the front door, locked it, and hid the key somewhere in the apartment. Bukayev first tried to persuade her, then he begged. His voice trembled, one lie piling on top of another, but the woman was unyielding. Time passed, and Bukayev understood more and more clearly. If he stayed here, he would be caught. Then he went back to the kitchen, took a large knife, and hid it in the pocket of his hoodie. He approached his mother again and demanded the key. When she refused once again, fear and panic finally took over. Sergei pulled out the knife and struck. The woman cried out in pain and instinctively grabbed her wound. Blood instantly soaked her housecoat. She stepped back, staring at her son with wide-open eyes. Bukayev didn't lower the knife, though he didn't try to strike again, but the woman feared for her life. She told him where she had put the key. Bukayev grabbed the key, opened the door, and immediately called an ambulance. When the dispatcher asked what had happened, he calmly replied, "A suicide attempt. The woman stabbed herself with a knife." When asked who was calling, he briefly replied, "Her partner." Later, during the interrogation, Bukayev insisted that he did not want to take his mother's life. He just wanted to scare her, make her give up the key, and get out of the apartment at any cost. Fortunately for the woman, the injury turned out to be non-lethal and she was able to recover. Finally, after leaving the house, Bukayev and Surkov changed clothes, got into a taxi, and went to Ufa. At the roadside checkpoint, they stopped by a cafe to grab a bite to eat. There, they accidentally ran into an acquaintance of Surkov, a local guy nicknamed Napoleon. He immediately recognized Konstantin. Surkov and Bukayev quickly made up a story, saying they were just going to Ufa to unwind and take a break for a couple of days from boring Kumertau. Napoleon believed them and went on with them. In the capital of Bashkiria, the first thing they did was sell part of the stolen goods and their personal belongings, a phone, jewelry, and a Sochi 2014 coin. They needed money urgently, but the two residents of the small town of Kumertau felt completely lost in the big city. They had trouble finding their way and wandered the streets. They couldn't stay anywhere and had no money, so they decided to spend the night in the forest on the outskirts of Ufa. Bukayev brought a tent with him, so that's where they settled for the night. The next day, they finally made it to the M5 Federal Highway. The plan was simple yet bold, to leave Bashkiria through Kazakhstan or Samara, then dash to Crimea and disappear there forever. But these plans were not meant to come true. After a night on the cold ground, Bukayev and Surkov were terribly hungry and tormented by thirst. They went to a nearby gas station. They decided to sell a phone and buy some food. But by that time, news of the mass slaughter was already spreading throughout the Republic. The task forces were stationed at the criminals' addresses, and their descriptions were broadcast on local channels. It turned out to be easy to figure out who exactly could have carried out such a bloody massacre. The friends of the victims helped, as they knew who was at Maria's apartment that night. Some of the neighbors saw Surkov and Bukayev leaving the building in the morning.
Well, at 7 o'clock, around 7, or a little after 7, I was leaving the building. As I was leaving the first floor and opened the plastic door, I heard a door slam upstairs. I assumed it was Masha heading to school, but instead, two guys came out. One of them was a bit shorter, the other was taller.
And Bukayev's mother also talked about her son's behavior. One of the drivers who stopped at the gas station recognized the guys who were wanted by the Republic's police. As early as April 18, that is, a day after the crime, they were detained. If you want even more videos, go to Boosty if you're from Russia, and to Patreon if you're not from Russia. There you'll find exclusive videos that aren't on YouTube. The links are below the video. Charges against Surkov-Bukayev were brought under several articles. Deprivation of life of more than two persons with particular cruelty, points A, D, ZHK of Part 2 of Article 105 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation. Sexual acts of violence against those under 18.A of Part 3 of Article 132 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation. Theft, points A and B of Part 2 of Article 158 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation. Intentional destruction or damage to property. Part 2, Article 167 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation. Both of them partially admitted their guilt, and Bukayev insisted that he had a pistol with him, which he used to deal with the victims. Surkov, on the other hand, completely denied the fact of assaulting Nastya Semenovskik. One of the versions considered by the investigation was ritual murder. Surkov and Peresunka dabbled in dark themes, and according to some reports, Masha was also involved in this, posting photos on social media of her hand with a drawn pentagram and other occult symbols. Additionally, investigators were troubled by the bloody patterns on Nastya Semenovskik's body. But both Bukayev and Surkov denied this version. Surkov's relatives also got involved, stating that his supposed fascination with mysticism was just an image and a show for the public, and in reality, he wasn't involved in anything like that. The trial took place in a tense atmosphere. The hearings were closed to the press almost until the very end. The relatives demanded a life sentence. The mothers cried and asked what their children had done to deserve such a fate. When the media were finally allowed to speak with the criminals, Surkov said very little and insisted that he only wanted justice. Bukayev seemed willing to talk, but his lawyer forbade him from speaking to the press. In court, Bukayev tried to act insane. He rolled his eyes, muttered incoherently, twitched theatrically, and said that voices were commanding him. The forensic psychiatric examination found him fully sane, just like Konstantin Surkov, despite the fact that both of them were registered at a neuropsychiatric clinic. As soon as it became clear that he would be sent to a penal colony instead of doctors, Bukayev, in desperation, tried to swallow several pages of his criminal case right in the courtroom. The guards barely pulled the papers from his mouth in time. On May 18, 2016, the verdict was announced. Sergei Bukayev and Konstantin Surkov were sentenced to life imprisonment to be served in a high-security penal colony. In addition, they were ordered to pay compensation of 9 million rubles to the families of the victims. After the horrific massacre in a small apartment on the outskirts of Kumertau, the usual procedure for Russia began, searching for those responsible among those who should have prevented the tragedy. The Bashkiria prosecutor's office conducted an investigation of officials responsible for preventing offenses among those under 18. As a result, 19 police officials and educators were held disciplinarily responsible. Some received a reprimand, some received a severe reprimand, and some were demoted. According to the prosecutor's office, it was precisely the inaction of the staff of the Aviation Technical College, the police, the branch of the Criminal Executive Inspection, and the Commission on Juvenile Affairs. This led to the fact that none of the responsible persons were aware of the real situation and did not take a single step to stop the impending massacre. For example, the college where 16-year-old Masha studied was aware that the girl lived alone without her parents. The teachers regularly recorded her absences, had heard rumors that drunken young people were gathering in her apartment, but did not take any action. But I also don't really understand what measures, for example, a cultural studies teacher or a philosophy lecturer was supposed to take regarding some random girl in some random college group. What were they supposed to do about it? Write in the comments. No one put the girl on preventive supervision, no one called the police, no one reported it to the Juvenile Affairs Commission. The local police were also inactive. The district officer never checked the apartment where people under 18 regularly gathered to drink. When everything happened, commissions appeared, inspections began, and stern statements followed. Prosecutors conducted an inspection of the local branch of the Criminal Executive Inspection and, oh God, found serious violations there. As is known, Bukayev already had a criminal record. He received a suspended sentence for robbery and was under supervision until June 2014. However, during all this time, the inspection officers never checked on him either at his place of residence or at his place of study. I'm curious, though, if they had checked, would that have prevented anything in 2015? Nevertheless, they regularly filed fake reports about supposedly conducted preventive conversations. On paper, everything looked perfect, but in reality, Bukayev was left to his own devices, and as a result, the head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Bashkiria was held responsible for the violation. He was officially notified to eliminate the identified violations. The head of the branch of the Penal Enforcement Inspection resigned on his own. Official notices were also issued to the head of the Regional Federal Penitentiary Service, the chairman of the Commission on Juvenile Affairs under the Government of the Republic, and the acting rector of Ufa State Aviation Technical University. It was at the branch of this university, the Aviation Technical College, where 3 out of the 5 deceased studied. I wonder if the saleswoman from Pyaterochka should also have been held accountable, since it was there that 4 out of the 5 deceased used to buy cinnamon rolls in the mornings. Prosecutors demanded that additional measures be taken to prevent similar incidents and that those responsible be face strict disciplinary action. As a result, the deputy principal of the department where the deceased studied and one of the homeroom teachers were dismissed. At present, Sergei Bukayev and Konstantin Surkov are serving their sentences in the Black Dolphin Penal Colony, which is located in the city of Soliletsk, Orenburg region. And what do you think? Should parents be held responsible for their children? Or is the state actually right in treating parents themselves like children who need constant watching, while it blocks and bans everything and never lets them do anything? Write in the comments, leave likes or dislikes, and watch other videos on the Strashnota channel because they are also very interesting.